Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the rest of the news from the Sharks trade deadline today. And so the first piece of news is a pretty minor one. The Sharks have acquired Brandon Davidson from the Calgary Flames in exchange for future considerations. This seems to be a deal that works well for both teams. The Sharks at the moment, with Karlsson injured and Brendan Dillon traded, are a bit short-handed defensively, so picking up a player like Davidson to be someone to play over someone like Middleton is okay for the rest of this season, just so you can run with a somewhat competent team. And for the Flames, of course, the fact that they picked up both Derek Forbort and Erik Gustafsson at the deadline, maybe they just needed to clear some space in terms of contracts, so getting rid of Davidson works well for both teams and is a decent little trade. But moving on to the actual big things of the deadline, the first would be the fact that Joe Thornton will be staying put. He will be staying with the Sharks, which ended up being a bit of a surprise. Of course, Patrick Marleau was traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins in exchange for a third that has the potential to become a second-round pick, so it was somewhat expected that Thornton would also end up being on the move, but for whatever reason, it didn't end up happening. Now, I do doubt, considering all of the rumors that were surrounding Thornton moving up to the deadline, that he himself would have decided to not end up getting traded. And it seems as though it's more so maybe a situation where Doug Wilson didn't feel like he was getting very fair value for Thornton. I'm not sure. I feel like even if it was getting offered like a third or something like that for a player like Thornton, he probably would have just made it happen just to make Thornton happy, because Thornton has been such a good piece for the Sharks for so long. But whatever ended up being the case, Thornton is still here with the Sharks, and with this next piece of news, and with Couture still injured, Thornton's going to be taking on an even greater role with the Sharks for these last 20 games down the stretch, basically being that first-line center. Because the biggest news for the Sharks of the day was the fact that they traded Barclay Goodrow and a third-round pick to the Tampa Bay Lightning in exchange for a first-round pick, as well as Anthony Greco, who's basically playing the role that we saw Perron play in the Erik Karlsson trade a couple years back, where it's basically just to make the contracts work out for the Lightning so they don't exceed the limit. So not at all an important player. The main part of this trade is the fact that the Sharks are getting a first-round pick, something Doug Wilson had set out to do at this deadline. And with Dillon being traded, who seemed to be the Sharks' biggest asset, and not getting a first-round pick in return there, and with the Sharks not really having much else to move, they end up making what ended up being a very surprise trade, a very out of left field kind of move. And this is pretty sad here for the Sharks. I really liked Barclay Goodrow as a player. He showed tremendous flexibility this season, being able to play up and down the lineup as so pleased. He was a big part of the Sharks' penalty kill this season that remained at the top of the league for massive chunks of the year. It was basically the only good, consistent part of the Sharks this season, and Goodrow played a big part of that. And we've seen with all these injuries, Goodrow has actually managed to take on a bigger role with the Sharks, at times playing over 20 minutes a game and actually filling that role decently well. And now all of a sudden, Goodrow is no longer with the Sharks, and it's not a situation like Marleau where, at the end of this season, the Sharks will just be able to re-sign Goodrow. Goodrow actually has then another year on his deal at a very affordable $925,000, less than $1 million. And so it's very possible we don't actually see Goodrow in a Sharks jersey again, now that he's with the Lightning for not just this year, but the year after that. And as I said, quite sad. Goodrow, of course, also now holds one of the biggest playoff goals for the San Jose Sharks in Sharks history, with that Game 7 goal against the Golden Knights. And so seeing him traded, even though it was in return for that first-round pick, is somewhat disappointing. Now, it was at first announced that it was going to be a Goodrow for a first-round pick, so at that point it was hard to be too sad about it, but with that third-round pick added on top of it, it does seem a bit more fair. It does mean something interesting for the Sharks. However, it seems as though, at least with what Doug Wilson has said, and with the fact that the Sharks have so many of these really big contracts, that they're going to be more or less forced to compete going into next season. This isn't really a team that is able to rebuild unless something crazy happens during the offseason. And the fact of the matter is that you take a look at the first round pick that they're getting from the Lightning, especially since it's going to be likely a very late first round pick, late 20s, maybe even in the 30s, depending on how the Lightning do in the playoffs, it's very likely that the player that they do draft is not going to be able to contribute to the Sharks team next season, and Goodrow would have been able to contribute to the Sharks team next season, and so they're going to be worse off for it. And so if this is a team that wants to compete, this is a trade that, it's, as I said, nice to get a first round pick, but is going to make them worse going into the following year. And we already see that the Sharks, this team, wasn't able to make the playoffs, and while they did underperform, I don't think anybody would disagree with that. It doesn't seem as though the regular performance would have necessarily been a playoff team. And so at the moment, if the Sharks are going to be trying to compete, they are in a worse position than they were in at the start of this season. We'll have to see if they make some sort of big splash in free agency, or if they actually do make some crazy trade to try and actually rebuild. Because at the moment, if they keep all of their big contracts and they're hoping to try and pull off a rebuild, well, it's not really going to happen, because it's going to be hard for this team to be one of the worst in the league. Currently, they find themselves, with all the bad luck they've had this season and the tons of injuries they've had, 5th last in the league, but I don't think that's going to happen again. And if anything, if they miss the playoffs, it could be something like 9th last, 10th last, 11th last, which might not be that great for a rebuilding team to get a pick like that. We've seen a team like Minnesota sort of skate along, either barely making the playoffs and getting a 16th or 17th overall, or barely missing and getting a 14th or 15th overall. And the Wild have remained basically in purgatory for a very, very long time, and we don't want to see the same thing happen with the Sharks, because they're never going to be worse than the Red Wings. They're never going to be worse than the Senators or the Kings or whoever might be the worst team in the league that year, because of all these great players that they still have on the team. So while the Sharks might not be able to put it all together to make the playoffs, I don't think it's all going to fall apart to miss the playoffs. And so the situation is that the Sharks are now in a worse spot to compete next season because of this trade, but they're not really in a spot to rebuild either. So basically, in conclusion, I guess you could say, is that it's nice that the Sharks got this first round pick, but it makes this offseason quite difficult to navigate for Doug Wilson, and maybe he has some sort of crazy plan moving forward, which makes me excited to see what happens in the offseason. But if he can't make it work out, the Sharks could be in for some rough years in the future. Class dismissed.